Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Vice Chair Jazz Lewis and the entire Capital Budget Subcommittee, just want to thank everyone for being here today for today's Capital Budget Subcommittee hearing. First, we're going to hear from the Historic St. Mary's City Commission. Before we get started, just to let you know, we have another subcommittee that's still having their hearings, so we'll probably see other members come in throughout the hearing. So presenting for the Historic St. Mary's City Commission, we have the budget analyst, Ms. Elizabeth Weibel. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. The Historic St. Mary's City Commission oversees the Historic St. Mary's City Park and Living History Museum in St. Mary's County. On the first page of the analysis, you'll see that there are 4 projects planned in the CIP, though only one of them receives funding in fiscal 2026. All of the planned funding is in this chart is in GO bonds, although the commission gets some additional funding from the Historic St. Mary's City Foundation. Page 3 has details on the Visitor Center conversion. This is a new project that is planned to receive funds, or $381,000 specifically in fiscal 2026. By way of background, construction is almost complete on the new Maryland Heritage Interpretive Center, which is expected to open in spring or summer of 2026, and will then serve as the new visitor center for the park. And then once that's open, the plan is to convert the existing visitor center and an adjacent storage facility into an education and artisan center with flexible programming spaces, areas for staff and for offices, and for storage, and some additional restrooms for the park as well. The $381,000 that's planned in fiscal 2026 is to start planning for the project, and then construction would occur in fiscal 28 and 29. The total estimated cost for the visitor center conversion is just under $15 million. Other projects in the CIP that do not receive funding in 2026 include the Site Improvements Project, which is outlined on page 4. This is an ongoing project that brings together a lot of smaller infrastructure improvements projects, things like accessible paths, driveways, fencing, signage, and some smaller building renovations. The Site Improvements Projects received $2 million in fiscal 2025. It does not receive any funding in fiscal 26 due to a high balance of remaining unencumbered funds. And similar to last year, DLS recommends adopting narrative requesting a report that details encumbrances and expenditures on site improvement projects, including a separate accounting of the projects that are funded by GO bonds. And text of that recommended narrative is on page 2. The second project we have is the new collection storage and maintenance facility. This will have a storage for maintenance equipment as well as specialized climate-controlled storage for museum collections. The park is an active archaeological site, so they need a place to store artifacts. And funding is planned to begin in fiscal 2027, which is just bumping up the date when existing storage is expected to run out of space, which is sometime in calendar 2028. And then finally, the Leonard Calvert House exhibit. This is to construct a recreation of the house of Maryland's first colonial governor. It previously received funding for archaeological research on the site, so that excavation and research is ongoing. And additional GO bond funding is expected to begin in fiscal 2028. That concludes my analysis, and I can take any questions you have.
Great, thank you very much, Ms. Weibel. Are there any questions from members of the Capital Budget Subcommittee for Ms. Weibel? This afternoon we have joining us from the Historic St. Mary's City Commission, Dr. John Seidel, Executive Director. Thank you very much for being here.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. It's a pleasure to see you all again. With me this afternoon on behalf of the commission are Admiral Tim Healy to my right, who is the chair of the commission, and to his right is our new Director of Advancement and Communication, Mike Bellis. To my left is our COO, Peter Carocchio, and to his left is our CFO, Doug Hunter. You have my written testimony, and so I'm going to summarize, highlight, and keep it brief. First, we concur with the governor's budget and the analyst's recommendations. Ms. Weibel has been a pleasure to work with. She is very thorough. And in her comments, she correctly noted that there's been a lag in encumbering site improvement funds. This was also noted by DBM, and it's resulted in the zeroing out of what we had hoped would be $1 million this year for much needed improvements. The lag in encumbrance is a legacy issue. It's something that we've been working with for some time. It's been a great concern to all of us at this table. We've worked hard to resolve it with weekly internal project updates, with regular communication with our colleagues in DGS, constantly pushing contractors and other measures. These have paid off so that we've just recently completed $2.2 million in projects And there's another 1.7 million worth that are scheduled for completion just in the next few months. That's a chapel exhibit, a restaurant, slave quarter renovations, and bathrooms. And in addition, we've got a $500,000 ADA accessible pier that has just been, it's in a construction blackout during the winter, will be ready to go and should be completed, we hope, by June. So that's a backlog of about 4.4 million in site improvements that are now either complete or very rapidly nearing completion. There are a few other projects that are really kind of out of our hands at this point as they're in the approval and design process, but I can tell you without hesitation that on our end, we're ready to execute. We aim to get these things done. So I understand the rationale for excluding site improvement funds in the FY26 budget, especially given the fiscal climate, but I do want to make two important points. First, as I've noted, those unencumbered funds are a legacy problem that we're rapidly resolving. And second, I'm a bit concerned that the absence of site improvements funds this coming year will slow down our preparations for the upcoming 400th anniversary of the founding of Maryland, especially if we can't make it up next year. It does risk some negative impacts on visitor experience, and we all know that deferred maintenance simply ends up costing us more in the long run, so we're anxious to get those projects underway. We'll obviously be very happy to report on our progress in December of 25 as requested, and we hope that that may result in a resumption and a catch-up in the much-needed site improvement funds. With regard to the $381,000 in capital funds for conversion of an education and artist center, I commented on that in my written testimony. We're really grateful for those design funds and eager to move forward. My written testimony also highlights our growing need for additional climate-controlled storage space, which Ms. Weibel referred to, for our collections, and we propose to meet that with a dual-function building, both for collections on the one hand and also for a sometimes ignored maintenance program. The first infusion for funds for that project is scheduled for FY27. I just want to make sure that we are all aware that we project that our current storage facility will reach capacity in calendar 2028. So this cuts it a bit fine. Without adequate storage, we jeopardize our museum accreditation. That in turn threatens federal funding as well as inter-museum loans. We've explored all possible alternatives for collection space and ruled them out, so this is something that we do need to track carefully. In closing, I just want to underscore the scope of our needs. I think many of you know our site. It's much bigger than most recognize. It's not a single museum, but instead it's 835 acres, 2.5 miles of river frontage, something like 5 miles of ADA accessible and recreational trails. We have 100 buildings. Those include archaeology labs, collection facilities, reconstructions like the 1676 State House, the chapel, Farthing's Ordinary Complex. We got museum installations, a living history farm, a reconstructed tall ship, the Maryland Dove, and something like 300 plus archaeological sites. So it's large, it's complex, and our infrastructure is aging. We take our role as the stewards of this incredible jewel in Maryland's historic sites seriously, even in normal times. But this is not a normal time, because in 2034, 9 years from now, we will celebrate the 400th anniversary of Maryland's founding. The state was born there, and if we're prepared, the 400th anniversary can serve as a real catalyst, we believe, for economic development in the region, especially through heritage tourism and related activity. A lot of folks say 9 years, it's a very long time. I know that nobody knows better than you all that 9 years in terms of capital planning and then execution is a very, very short, and it's a rapidly narrowing window. So I think it's critical that we keep that date firmly in mind as we consider future capital projects and move forward. We're really excited by the potential. We look forward to working with you to realize it. So on behalf of all of our staff and the tens of thousands of Maryland citizens who visit us every year, thank you. We greatly appreciate your support and that of the Moore Miller administration. And with that, I'd be very happy to take any questions you might have.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Seidel. Are there any questions from members of the committee? Thank you very much. That concludes the hearing for Historic St. Mary's City Commission.
Thank you.
Committee will now move on to Department of Veterans and Military Families. And our budget analyst is Ms. Yoshidara Rai. And from the Department of Veterans and Military Families, we have Secretary Anthony Woods, and also Marion Charlin and Russell Ware. And Ms. Rai.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members. Today, I will be presenting the fiscal 2026 capital budget analysis for the Department of Veterans and Military Families, or DVMF. The cover page charts on pages 1 and 2 show that the 5-year CIP for DVMF includes 2 veteran cemetery expansion projects. Fiscal 26 includes $113,000 in GEO bonds for the Crownsville Veteran Cemetery Expansion and Improvement Phase 4 project. As was briefly mentioned in the capital fiscal briefing last week, the new state Veterans Home project is currently on hold. This is because the state did not receive a federal award for the project. As a result, the governor's budget includes a proposed transfer of $62.9 million that were previously authorized for the project in the Dedicated Purpose Account, DPA, to general funds. The fiscal 25 federal fund appropriation of $47.9 million is also canceled for the same reason. After this transfer and cancellation, the new Veterans Home project has a total prior appropriation of $6.7 million. This includes $4.2 million that was transferred from DPA to the Department of General Services in fiscal 23 for project design, and the remaining balance of $2.5 million to complete the project design. We discuss more about this project later in the analysis. Moving on to page 3, the first key observation highlights the delay in anticipated start of federal grant funds starting fiscal 26 for the department's 2 cemetery expansion projects. The Federal Department of Veterans Affairs, USDVA, requires that there is no state residency requirement for state cemetery projects to be eligible for the federal grant. But the current Maryland law requires veterans to be a Maryland resident to be buried in a state veteran cemetery. 2 departmental bills, House Bill 138 and Senate Bill 237, introduced this session, aim to remove the state residency requirement, making the state eligible for the federal grant program. The third observation notes that DVMF's long-term plan included renovating the only existing Charlotte Hall Veterans Home, but given the uncertainty in receiving federal funds for the new Veterans Home, the renovation plans will likely get impacted. As of July 2024, the department noted that no preparation for the facility renovation has been made. Pages 4 and 5 highlight the Crownsville Veteran Cemetery project with a fiscal 26 recommendation of $113,000 in GEO bonds to fully fund and continue project design. This recommendation is $4.8 million less than the requested amount because federal fund request for the project was deferred from fiscal 26 to fiscal 27 due to a delay in project schedule. The total estimated project cost has increased by 23% in fiscal 26 CIP. The department notes that this is mostly due to the incorrect adjustment of installation of pre-placed crypts in previous project cost estimates. The project design is now scheduled to begin in March 2025 and will be fully funded by the state's funds previously authorized. The state funds for project design will be reimbursed through the federal grant program, and the project construction will be entirely federally funded. One concern remains on the availability of federal funds, which is contingent on the removal of the residency requirement. If legislation introduced in the 2025 session fails, the project will not be eligible for federal reward and could be further delayed. At the bottom of page 5 is Garrison Forest Veteran Cemetery Expansion Project. This project received its first funding in fiscal 24. A delay in its schedule resulted in deferring fiscal 25 funding to fiscal 26, which has been further deferred to fiscal 27 because of the need to remove the state residency requirement. We request the department to comment on the current status of this project and the possibility of the project being eligible for the federal grant program in fiscal 26 if the departmental bills to remove state residency requirement are enacted. We also request the department to brief the committees on the current ranking of both cemetery projects on the federal grant priority list and how likely they are to receive federal award to begin construction in fiscal 27. Pages 6 to 7 highlights the new state Veterans Home project. As mentioned earlier, this project is currently on hold because the project did not receive federal grant award. The state appropriated $63.3 million and $6.3 million to the DPA in fiscal 23 and 24 respectively to meet the 35% upfront state appropriation requirement for this project. Project design was initiated in July 2023 with an anticipated completion in June 2025. The design is currently underway and the cost is about $7 million, which is completely funded with state funds. The fiscal 25 budget also appropriated $47.9 million in federal fund and the remaining federal cost share of $81.3 million for fiscal 26 and 27 in anticipation of receiving the federal grant. But the federal grant was not awarded. Also, the department reports that the state's application currently ranks 80 out of 81 projects in Priority 1 list. For context, as of now, projects ranked before the new state Veterans Home project require approximately $1.1 billion before the new state Veterans Home project becomes eligible for the federal grant. While the USDVA occasionally clears Priority 1 backlogs, the last time this happened was in federal fiscal 2018 for $615 million grant awards. As mentioned in the beginning, due to the low probability of a federal award, the governor's fiscal 26 budget plan includes proposed transfer of the unencumbered balance of $62.9 million in the DPA for the project to the general fund. After this, $2.5 million will remain in the DPA to complete the design work. Once the proposed transfer takes place, the project will drop to Priority 2 list due to unavailability of the state's 35% matching fund. But once the state's matching fund is restored, the project will move back to Priority 1 list. Although it is unlikely in the current fiscal climate, one option for the state is to fund the entire project with state funds, which is about $200 million to help address the unmet bed needs. But this will include waiting for a significant period of time before federal reimbursements for 65% of the total project takes place. On page 8, Exhibit 1 shows the state's veteran population by county. The state has a need of 1,100 veteran facility beds based on the state's veteran population. The USDVA estimate for Maryland's veteran population shows a statewide decline from 348,000 in fiscal 23 to 340,000 in fiscal 24. The occupancy rate at Charlotte Hall Veterans Home has declined from 403 residents in December 2019 to 271 residents in December 2024. Appendix 1 on page 9 highlights the operating budget impact of the Crownsville Veteran Cemetery Expansion Project. DLS's recommendation is on page 4 to approve $113,000 in GEO bond for the Crownsville Veteran Cemetery Expansion Project. This concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Rai, for your presentation. Are there any questions from members of the committee? Secretary Woods, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. So thank you so much for your analysis as well. Chair Lewis, Vice Chair Chang, it's a pleasure to be here. I'll keep my remarks brief and just allow us to go to questions as quickly as possible. I wanted to offer just one quick update with regard to the analysis. Moving forward with renovations at Charlotte Hall Veterans Home. Just last week, we signed our fund certification, and we're working in collaboration with DGS to begin a Part 1 and Part 2 analysis or design and engineering study, essentially, of how we can move forward with renovating that space to bring it in line with the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs new standards. So we're excited to update that. I also wanted to underscore the importance of what was mentioned, what we call the Burial Equity Act, which waives the residency requirement for being buried in a veteran cemetery here in the state. We're working, of course, in collaboration with you all in the legislature, and that is one that we think is quite important to have passed because of its implications for future grant opportunities. The last thing I would say is that this was actually a really excellent year last year. 5,100 veteran claims submitted, $44 million in value unlocked and brought to our veterans. Excellent progress in turning around operations at Charlotte Hall Veterans Home, including receiving joint accreditation from an external third party, which we're quite proud of. But I think one of the most important things that we're proud of is passing 24 bills that positively impact the veteran and military-connected community, and doing so in partnership with you all here in the legislature. And so we're thankful for that collaboration. We're here, of course, in support of the governor's allowance, and we're delighted to take questions if you have any.
Great. Thank you very much, Secretary Woods. We have a question from Delegate Ivy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Secretary, for being here. I completely understand why we're in this position today, why there's a pause on the new facility and the renovation, so on and so forth. My question is, if we're thinking about taking some innovative approaches to house individuals who are unhoused veterans, although we may not have a facility for them, you know, there are other programs like that have been implemented, say in Salisbury, where you give out a stipend, so on and so forth. Have there been any discussions on something like this?
Well, the first thing I'd say, Delegate Ivy, thank you very much for your concern. I do have some stats. In 2024, so that's the latest year we have really good numbers, there were about 312 unhoused veterans in the state, across the state. 101 of those veterans were in emergency shelters. 173 of them were in transitional housing, meaning about 38 were unhoused. We actually are very intentional about our operations at Charlotte Hall, particularly on the assisted living side. That, if you look at most other states, they've eliminated that because it's actually it loses revenue for every single day that you serve somebody who lives there. We feel it's actually really important to maintain operations there and have that option for our veterans for exactly the reason that you've pointed out, Delegate. Should a veteran find themselves in need of that type of facility and they meet our age requirement, it's a wonderful option for eliminating homelessness for our veterans. One other thing that I'd love to point to is we also operate the Maryland Veteran Trust Fund, which one of the most important things it does is provide individual emergency financial grants. Most often that is for helping a veteran come out of or avoid foreclosure or eviction. And so we found that to be a wonderful tool at preventing homelessness, but it is also a very flexible tool. And so if an unhoused veteran needs help with first month's or last, providing upfront security deposit or first month's or last month's rent, that is a wonderful option as well. So we're absolutely happy to explore all options and would be delighted to chat with you more about it as well.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Really appreciate your commitment here. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Are there any questions from members of the Capital Budget Subcommittee for Secretary Woods? Delegate Solomon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Secretary, it's good to see you. Thank you for being here and for all your work. I guess I'm just curious, obviously, the likelihood of federal funding maybe goes down going forward, as was quoted in here. What's the sort of long-term plan, given the uncertainty with the federal resources for the new home? And I know there have also been some conversations around, is Carroll County the best location, given the high density of veterans in other parts of the state? Just curious, again, long-term plans going forward, and maybe if there is a reevaluation of location, or if we're planning on going ahead, just trying to figure out alternative means of financing.
Thank you, Delegate. Very much appreciate the question. First thing I'd say from a long-term planning standpoint, that's part of why we find it, it's important to move forward as quickly as possible with renovation operations at Charlotte Hall Veterans Home. We really do want to continue to bring that up to a standard that we think our veterans deserve for the facility that they live in. So that's certainly a major part of it, and it's why we signed our fiscal, I'm sorry, forgetting the term. Fund certification just last week to get that process moving forward. You're absolutely right to look for alternative sites as well as potential solutions. But again, those would also be impacted by federal inaction in this particular case. So I think Yashua mentioned this, but $1.2 billion is the outstanding or unfunded portion of the veterans at the federal level of the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs construction budget. They have funded $150 million of that $1.2 billion backlog. And so it makes perfect sense that we were forced with this unfortunate situation. What I would also point out is the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs has been pretty forward-leaning and looking into what we would call basically aging in place options. And so we are working now to rebuild our relationship and reestablish our relationship with the federal VA, with the new administration there, and making it clear that Maryland is ready, willing, and able to work with the administration on basically bringing new options for aging in place and staying at home Those types of options we think are critical in helping to bridge that gap until we are able to construct the new home.
I was going to say, maybe there's an opportunity for us to use some of a smaller pool of capital funds to do the aging in place to help maintain the services for our veterans in the absence of getting the new building. Yeah, love to work with you on that. Thank you.
Certainly appreciate
Thank you, Mr.
that.
Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate Solomon. Are there any other questions from members of the committee? Great. Thank you very much, Secretary Woods. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
That ends the hearing for the Department of Veterans and Military Families. The committee will now move on to the Maryland Hospital Association. And our budget analyst is Ms. Victoria Martinez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Victoria Martinez, and I'll be presenting the Maryland Hospital Association budget analysis. MHA administers the private hospital grant program, in which private hospitals can apply for capital grants for projects that improve patient care. As shown on the cover page, the capital budget provides $22 million in GO bonds for 22 projects. Moving on to Exhibit 1 on page 6, this shows the project selected for fiscal 2026 grant funding, including the total cost of the project and the percentage that is state funded. And pages 7 through 10 have a summary of each of these projects. Moving on to the discussion of the first issue on page 11. This first issue provides an update on the status of projects funded through the program, which is summarized in Exhibit 2 on page 11 as well. And then moving on to the second issue, this discusses the increase in proposed funding for the program following Chapter 790, which stated that the governor may include an appropriation of $20 million for the program. Exhibit 3 on page 12 shows the increase in total funds following this legislation from $7.8 million in 2025 to $22.7 million in 2026. And Exhibit 4 summarizes the fiscal 2026 requests by state share. There were 12 projects that had a state share less than 15%, with some projects having a state share percentage as low as 0.7%. Funding projects at a lower than 15% does not demonstrate meaningful prioritization of funding and investment in projects, and these projects are also less dependent on state participation to move forward. So because of this, DLS recommends reducing the fiscal 2026 request by $5 million to remove funding for the 12 projects funded with the state share percentage lower than 15%, which would reduce the total appropriation for MHA to $17.7 million. That concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Martinez, for the analysis. Are there any questions from members of the Capital Budget Subcommittee for Ms. Martinez? This afternoon, we have joining us from the Maryland Hospital Association, Ms. Jane Cranky. Thank you for being here.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Chair Chang, Vice Chair Lewis, and members of the committee. My name is Jane Cranky. I'm here on behalf of the Maryland Hospital Association in strong support of these 22 hospital projects, totaling $22.6 million. First, we'd like to thank Ms. Martinez and our analysts at DBM, Ms. Godwin. They've been fantastic to work with, and we really appreciate their work. The 22 recommended projects that have been included in the capital budget, they support Maryland communities by improving maternal health care, expanding access to primary care, enhancing surgical services, and improving the environment of care, especially for patients in the behavioral health department who are experiencing behavioral health crisis, which are more and more youth. And we're very appreciative of the governor for including projects in the capital budget. The levels that they're included in reflect the levels our Hospital Bond Project Review Committee recommended them at. So our ask of this committee is to maintain those funding levels. I'd like to address the DLS recommendation to eliminate the $5 million in state funding for the 12 hospital projects. This recommendation is extremely concerning to us and would impact hospitals across the state, including some small, independent, and rural hospitals. Although the state contribution for these projects is less than maximum and some are pretty small, these are still really significant projects for these communities, and they were all vetted by our review committee that we have, and they have support from their delegations. So I sent out an email earlier today with letters for each project and you have to have that as part of your application. So you move forward, ensuring that you have the support of the community. So again, we ask you to reject this recommendation from DLS. Moving forward with the recommendation means you're not funding critical projects in these communities. My final point, we have 3 amendments that I wanted to note in our testimony, one for Atlantic General, one for Luminous Health Doctors Community Hospital, and then Adventist Healthcare Shady Grove Medical Center. We appreciate the committee's long-time support of the program and ask for a favorable report and maintain the funding. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Ms. Cranky. Are there any questions? Vice Chair Lewis.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the analysis, and good to see you again. So my question is going to be kind of difficult. I just want to come out and say that.
Sure.
For the recommendation for projects under 15%, and the recommendation for the state to not fund those, if we were to move forward with that, and you may or may not be able to answer this, would that shift the priorities that you guys have suggested for some of the others?
Would it change like which projects we're recommending?
Correct.
That's a great question. So MHA doesn't make the final determination. We have a review committee made up of peers from the hospital. So I'd have to take that back to think about. They really grappled just given the small, I mean, we have a larger pot of money, but our CEO says more money, more problems. And so we have more competition and more, there's such a need for access to capital funding that, we had 24 hospitals applying for $20 million. So I'd have to take it back to our review committee because they do go through a very deliberate process to prioritize these projects.
Yeah, I would encourage you to. And your CEO is a good friend of mine, so I know where you heard that from. But I would encourage you to. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sure.
Delegate Smith.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your testimony. Now, I know the amount that's being projected for, or recommended rather, for cuts are $5 million, but I want to know if you can discuss what the support of the state means to the ability to raise the other private funding.
Thank you so much for your question, Delegate. It's huge. Even having some seed money can help get more support from the community, help with fundraising. As you know, hospitals are in a tough financial situation, especially in this state. And so access to capital is incredibly challenging. And so they do everything they can to gain access to it. So it's incredibly challenging. And these projects are all really important, especially these emergency department renovations. I can't emphasize that enough. There are at least 3 that are making modifications to their emergency departments because they have children and young adults boarding there. And so a lot of them are modifying the environment so that they're comfortable and safe in these spaces. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just another thing I wanted to kind of unpack is that what makes this set of recommendations for this project, these sets of projects different from other things is that in order for them to even make this list, they have to really be shovel ready. Is that, I don't know if you could kind of share what distinguishes these projects from all types of projects that are being considered by the hospitals themselves.
Sure. Thank you so much for your question again. Shovel readiness is a huge component of our program. So DBM and DLS both attend our review committee meeting where the review committee makes a determination of which projects to fund. And that's one question we know that DBM always asks us, like, what is the timeline? When is this ready to go? These grants have 7-year terms, but they're expected to expend the majority of their funding within the fiscal year the funds are appropriated. So that is something we pay very close attention to. All of these are shovel-ready projects, ready to go as soon as they have access to the green light and the capital funding. Thank you.
Great. Are there any other questions from members of the Capital Budget Subcommittee for Ms. Cranky? Okay, thank you very much. That concludes the hearing for the Maryland Hospital Association, and that concludes today's Capital Budget Subcommittee hearing. Have a great day. Thanks.